The courtroom in Cleveland, Ohio, was steeped in a heavy, tense silence, so thick it felt as though the walls were closing in. The air was dense, stifling, the dim light from the ceiling casting shadows on the polished wooden floor, where every eye was fixed on an impending confrontation. Robert Bobby Malone, a 36-year-old police officer, stood there, uniform crisp, posture rigid, exuding an arrogance he didn't bother to conceal. His cold, defiant eyes locked onto William, a 58-year-old black man, seated in the witness stand, as if he had no right to be there, as if his very presence was something Bobby refused to acknowledge. He wasn't just challenging the law, he was challenging William himself. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the latest stories. Bobby was the epitome of untouchability. With slicked back brown hair and a perpetual smirk, he was accustomed to using his fists and badge to impose his will in Cleveland. William, a former dock worker, bore a lean frame, silver hair, and a weathered face etched with years of endurance. He'd seen eyes like Bobby's before, eyes of men who believed they stood above all, never held accountable, entering any room expecting instant submission. But today, in this courtroom, that wouldn't happen. William was here to testify against Bobby, who had assaulted a black man without cause, an incident he'd witnessed firsthand. His voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "Officer, sit down." Bobby didn't budge. Judge Clara Evans, a stern woman, slammed her gavel on the bench, her voice cutting like ice. "This is a court of law. You will sit down or you will be removed." Bobby's smirk widened, his eyes narrowing, arrogance blazing in every gesture. "I'd like to see you try," he shot back, his tone dripping with defiance, as if the world itself belonged to him. William sat there, hands clenched, eyes fixed on Bobby. He didn't flinch, didn't falter, just silently watched the man across from him, a man who always believed he'd win. The courtroom in Cleveland trembled under the weight of the words Bobby Malone had just spat out. "I don't take orders from people like you," he said, his voice laced with venom, each word a dagger slicing through the already suffocating air. The crowd, lawyers in tailored suits, reporters with pens poised over paper, security guards standing still as statues, froze, sensing the meaning behind his words. They shifted uneasily, eyes darting between Bobby and William, waiting to see how the old black man would react to such blatant contempt. But William didn't waver. He sat there, calloused hands gripping his thighs, his sharp gaze locked on Bobby, as if he'd already seen through the power game he was playing. William knew men like Bobby well. He'd encountered them all his life, from the back-breaking days at Cleveland's docks, where he was treated like a shadow, to the times police barked at him just for the color of his skin. Bobby was no different, a man who believed his badge gave him license to cross every line, that he could do anything without consequence. Today, Bobby stood accused of assaulting a black man without reason during a patrol, and William was the only witness brave enough to speak. His voice rose again, calm, but sharp as a blade. "I saw him beat that man. No reason but his own anger. I was there, and I won't stay silent." Bobby let out a slow, mocking laugh, shaking his head as if William's words were a joke. He stepped closer, polished shoes clicking on the wooden floor, eyes narrowing with disdain. "Old man," he said, his voice dropping but cutting like ice, "you think that mouth of yours can change anything. No one cares what you saw." His arrogance spilled out like a wave, pressing down on the room. He leaned toward William, close enough that the cheap cologne on his uniform stung the air. "People like you," Bobby continued, his voice low and menacing, "should know your place." Judge Clara Evans slammed her gavel, the dry crack of wood piercing the tense silence. "Officer Malone," she said, her voice hard as steel, "you will sit down immediately, or I will have you removed." But Bobby didn't care. He glanced at Clara just long enough to smirk, then refocused on William, as if she wasn't worth his attention. "This is a court of law," Clara pressed, her eyes narrowing, "and you will respect it." Bobby responded with another shake of his head, and a low, smug laugh, as if the law was something he could bend whenever he pleased. William didn't move, didn't blink. He'd faced men like Bobby his whole life, men who used power to intimidate, to silence. But he wasn't here to back down. "I know who you are," William said, his voice steady but carrying an unshakable strength. "And I know what you did. You can't hide forever." His words cut through the room like a cold wind, making Bobby's smirk falter for a split second. But in an instant, his arrogance flared back, stronger than ever. Bobby straightened, chest puffed out, hands clenched as if holding something back. "You want to play this game?" he growled, his eyes flashing with danger. "I'll show you who's in charge here." The room held its breath, everyone sensing the fire smoldering between these two, one fueled by the arrogance of a perpetual winner, the other by the resilience of a man with nothing left to lose. Security guards under Charles "Chuck" Hayes shifted slightly, hands on their belts, but no one dared act yet. The air in the Cleveland courtroom hung heavy as lead, the tension so thick every sound seemed swallowed by the stifling silence. Bobby's final warning, "You'll regret opening your mouth," lingered in the air, a dark prophecy. William sat in the witness stand, eyes never leaving Robert, Bobby, Malone, his calloused hands clenched on his thighs, not a tremor in them. He'd just challenged a man who believed himself untouchable, and Bobby, with arrogance blazing in every move, couldn't take it anymore. The smirk vanished from his lips, replaced by a furious sneer, his eyes glinting with danger. Judge Clara Evans slammed her gavel again, the sharp crack slicing through the quiet. "Officer Malone, I order you to sit down now," she shouted, her voice icy, eyes narrowed with authority. But Bobby didn't listen. He no longer cared about Clara, the law, or anyone in the room. All he saw was William, a black old man daring to stand against him, daring to crack the wall of power he'd built over years. "You think you can take me down?" Bobby snarled, stepping closer, his polished shoes clicking on the wood. "You're nothing." William didn't reply, just met Bobby's gaze, his eyes hard as steel, fearless. He'd had enough of years being trampled, dismissed, beaten down for his skin. Today, he wasn't here to stay quiet. "I know the truth," William said, his voice calm but cutting, "and you can't silence me." His words poured fuel on Bobby's rage. The crowd held its breath, feeling the electricity in the air. Security under Charles "Chuck" Hayes shifted, but no one intervened. Not yet. And then it happened. Fast and brutal, Bobby's fist cracked like a gunshot in the courtroom. He lunged, right hand clenched, landing a punch square on William's face. The force snapped his head to the side, blood spraying from his nose and lips, dripping onto his worn shirt. William toppled from the witness chair, hitting the wooden floor with a heavy thud. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Someone screamed, a short, panicked cry. Papers scattered from the lawyer's table. A few people leapt from their seats, eyes wide with horror. Bobby stepped back, chest heaving, fists still clenched, as if he'd just done something entirely justified, as if he'd righted a wrong in the world. Clara shot up from her bench, gavel still in hand, her face pale with shock and fury. "Malone," she yelled, her voice trembling with outrage. "What have you just done?" But Bobby didn't answer. He stood there, eyes locked on William, his smirk creeping back. To him that punch was a final statement, that no one, especially not a black old man like William, could challenge him without paying a price. The crowd erupted into chaos, murmurs swelling like breaking waves, some pointing at Bobby, others covering their mouths in disbelief. Chuck Hayes and the security team finally moved, hands on their belts, but they hesitated, eyes flickering between Clara and Bobby. They weren't sure what to do. Bobby was one of them, a cop, and the system had always shielded him. But this time, it was different. William lay on the floor, breathing heavily, blood streaking his weathered face. Yet, he didn't stay down. One hand gripped the chair's edge, slowly pulling himself up, his eyes still fixed on Bobby. The entire courtroom held its breath, no longer seeing a frail victim but a storm about to break. Bobby turned back, his smirk wavering as he realized William wouldn't stay down. "What more do you want?" he growled, stepping closer, fists clenching as if ready to strike again. But this time, William didn't wait. With all the strength he had left, William surged forward, his thin hands shoving hard into Bobby's chest. The sudden force sent him staggering, crashing to the wooden floor with a resounding thud. The crowd gasped, not in fear, but in awe, mixed with exhilaration. Bobby, the man who thought himself untouchable, lay there, eyes wide, breathing hard, unable to believe what had happened. William stood tall, blood still dripping down his face, but he didn't care. He looked down at Bobby, his voice trembling with anger, but strong as thunder. "I've had enough. You can't keep me down anymore." In that moment, the room shifted. The arrogance on Bobby's face melted into panic. He'd expected William to break, to crumble under the weight of his fist, but he didn't give him that satisfaction. "Who do you think you are?" William pressed, each word a hammer blow. "You hit me, but you can't break me." The crowd exploded, some cheering, others pointing at Bobby, murmurs rippling like waves. Judge Clara Evans, still behind her bench, gavel clenched, her face pale with shock, finally spoke. "Malone, you just assaulted a witness in a court of law." Bobby scrambled to his feet, breathing ragged, eyes darting between William and Clara. "You can't touch me," he shouted, his voice cracking, but his confidence had shattered. William didn't back down, standing there, chest heaving, hands trembling with adrenaline, eyes never leaving Bobby. Clara pounded her gavel repeatedly, the wood cracking like thunder amid the chaos. "Take him into custody." Now, security under Charles Chuck Hayes moved at last, but they hesitated, glances shifting to Bobby, a colleague, a man the system had always protected. Chuck stepped forward, hand on Bobby's shoulder, but he jerked away, yelling, "Get off me. He attacked me first." His excuse rang hollow, unbelievable, after what everyone had seen. William stood firm, wiping another streak of blood from his face, his voice rising again, clear and sharp. "The whole world will see who you are, Malone. No one can cover for you anymore." His words were a final blade, piercing Bobby's arrogance, leaving him frozen, his face twisted in disbelief. The courtroom shook with William's unexpected strength. Bobby, still on one knee, looked up at him, feeling something he'd never known, fear. He'd pushed too far, and William, the man he'd dismissed, had tipped the scales toward justice. Clara raised a hand, her voice cutting through the noise. "Get him out of here." But William's act wasn't just a shove, it was a declaration, a fire ignited, and no one in that room could extinguish it. The crowd erupted, shouts and applause, mingling with murmurs spreading through the room. No one could believe what they'd just witnessed. A frail black old man, weak in their eyes, had just knocked down a belligerent cop in the middle of a courtroom. The noise swelled like crashing waves. A young lawyer leapt up, pointing at Bobby, shouting, "He attacked the witness." A reporter near the window scribbled furiously, eyes fixed on William, while others whispered in disbelief, "Did he really do that?" The chaos spread fast, but not from fear, from excitement, from a spark of hope flickering in a room once weighed down by injustice. William stood tall, breathing hard, blood dripping to the floor, but he didn't care. His gaze stayed locked on Bobby, as if to say this wasn't over. Bobby clambered up, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. "You can't touch me," he bellowed, his voice breaking, pointing at William as if still ready to charge. But his confidence was gone, replaced by the desperation of a man who'd lost control. He turned to the crowd, then the security guards, shouting, "He attacked me first. You saw it." But no one answered. The crowd stared at him in silence, their eyes full of contempt, as if they'd just watched an untouchable man become a laughingstock. Bobby turned back to William, fists clenched, but this time, he didn't dare step forward. Judge Clara Evans pounded her gavel repeatedly, the wood cracking like thunder amid the chaos. "Order!" she shouted, her voice trembling with fury, her face pale, but her eyes icy. She rose from her chair, gavel still in hand, her gaze sweeping the room before locking on Bobby. "Malone," she said, her voice clear and steely, "you just assaulted a witness in my court of law. Where do you think you are?" Bobby froze, mouth opening to argue, but Clara gave him no chance. "I warned you," she continued, "and now you'll face the consequences." Clara raised her hand, her voice slicing through the noise like a blade. "Security, take him into custody, now." Charles Chuck Hayes, head of the security team, stepped forward, placing a hand on Bobby's shoulder, but he jerked away violently, shouting, "Get your hands off me. You wouldn't dare do anything." Chuck hesitated, his eyes flicking to Clara, then back to Bobby, a colleague, a man once shielded by the system. The other security guards stood behind him, hands on their belts, but none moved immediately. They knew Bobby, knew the unspoken handshakes in the Cleveland Police Department, and knew that arresting him meant breaking an unwritten rule. But Clara didn't back down. She slammed her gavel again, so hard the sound echoed through the room. "I said take him," she yelled, her voice no longer a command but a declaration of war. "No one turns my courtroom into a place of violence." Chuck finally acted, grabbing Bobby's arm tightly, pulling him to his feet. The other guards moved in, surrounding him, but Bobby thrashed, screaming, "You can't do this. I'm a cop." His shouts rang hollow amid the crowd's noise, now shifting to clear cheers as they watched him being subdued. Will stood there, his breathing steadying, blood drying on his weathered face. He said nothing more, just watched Bobby being dragged away, his gaze never leaving the man who'd attacked him. The crowd clapped harder, some shouting, "Justice for Will." A reporter near the window turned to a colleague, whispering, "This'll be the hottest story of the week." Clara sat down, still gripping her gavel, her face softening slightly, but her eyes remaining sharp. She knew this wasn't just an assault, it was a crack in the system, and Will had brought it into the light. The courtroom in Cleveland still vibrated with the aftermath of what had just unfolded. Robert "Bobby" Malone was hauled off the wooden floor by Charles Chuck Hayes and the security guards, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. He struggled, his polished shoes slipping on the surface, his voice crying out in desperation, "You can't do this. I'm a cop." But his shouts were lost amid the crowd's cheers, now a swelling wave of support for William "Will" Turner. Bobby twisted his head, his panicked eyes scanning the room for a familiar face, an ally in the crowd, but no one responded. For the first time, he looked uneasy, like a cornered animal. Will sat back in the witness chair, blood dried on his weathered face, his breathing steadying. He said nothing, just watched Bobby being led away, his sharp gaze cutting through the arrogance that once dominated the man's features. The crowd kept clapping, some yelling, "Justice for Will." Murmurs spread, the reporter near the window turning to a colleague, voice urgent, "Get it all down. This is the biggest story Cleveland's ever seen." Outside the courtroom, camera shutters clicked as the press gathered at the door, lenses aimed at the exit, where Bobby would soon emerge. The case was no longer just a trial, it had become an event, a crack laid bare for all to see. Chuck held Bobby's arm tightly, pulling him toward the side door, but Bobby still fought, shouting, "Do you know who I am? You'll regret this." But his threats were now just empty echoes. The other guards surrounded him, their eyes wavering between reluctance and duty. They'd worked with Bobby, laughed with him in the Cleveland precinct break room, seen him dodge trouble with quiet handshakes. But this time no one stepped up for him. The system that once protected him stayed silent, as if it too felt the pressure from the crowd and Will's unrelenting stare. Judge Clara Evans sat back in her chair, releasing the gavel but keeping her gaze icy, sweeping over the room. Now returning to order, she looked at Will, nodding slightly in quiet acknowledgement, then turned to the court clerk. "Record this incident in the minutes. Malone will be charged with assaulting a witness." Her voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. The crowd quieted, hanging on her every word, sensing the scales of justice finally tipping their way, if only a little. Clara knew Bobby's actions weren't just an assault, they were a challenge to the system she represented, and she wouldn't let it slide. Bobby was dragged out of the room, the metallic clink of handcuffs ringing clear. As the door shut behind him, his face twisted in disbelief, as if he still couldn't grasp what had happened. He'd walked in with the arrogance of an untouchable man, but now left as a criminal, head bowed, no defiance left in his brown eyes. Outside, the press mob surged forward, flashes popping relentlessly, voices shouting, "Malone, why'd you attack him?" But he didn't answer, just lowered his head, letting Chuck shove him into the waiting patrol car. Will remained seated, wiping another streak of dried blood from his face with his sleeve, his eyes fixed on the door where Bobby had disappeared. He didn't need to speak, his actions had said it all. The crowd in the courtroom looked at him with reverence, some whispering, "He's not afraid of anything." An older lawyer turned to a colleague, voice low, "Today's the day the system had to face itself." Will didn't seek praise, but he knew that shove wasn't just personal resistance, it was a spark, and that spark was spreading. Clara tapped her gavel one last time, her voice ringing out, "Court is adjourned, will resume when order is restored." But everyone knew the old order had been shattered. Bobby, who once believed he could do anything without consequence, now faced total ruin. His reputation dissolved into smoke before dozens in the courtroom, and hundreds outside, through the press's lenses. Will stood, stepping down from the witness stand, head held high, hands no longer trembling. He didn't need thanks or glory, he just wanted justice, and today, he'd claimed a piece of it. The courtroom door in Cleveland closed behind Robert Bobby Malone, but the story didn't end there. The wail of police sirens faded, carrying away the image of a once arrogant cop now bowed in disgrace. Outside the courthouse, the press erupted, flashes firing non-stop, voices shouting for answers from Bobby, but he stayed silent, his empty gaze fixed on the car floor. Meanwhile, William "Will" Turner stepped down from the witness stand, head held high, hands steady. The dried blood on his face was now a badge of victory, and his eyes, sharp, unyielding, spoke what no words could. He'd done what no one expected. The incident spread like wildfire through Cleveland. Within hours, a video shot by a reporter in the courtroom hit social media, its headline screaming, "Cop attacks black old man in court and gets fought back." Thousands of views turned to millions, comments flooding in, "He's a hero," and "Time for justice to speak." Local news, then national, jumped on it. Evening broadcasts replaying Bobby's punch and Will's shove. Will, an ordinary dockworker from Cleveland's port, became the center of a media storm he never sought. Crowds swelled outside the courthouse, not just reporters, but citizens, workers, mothers, youths, holding handmade signs, "Justice for Will," and "End police violence." Chants rose in Cleveland's cold air, their breath turning to white mist, but their spirits ablaze. What started as a small protest grew, stretching from the courthouse to downtown, where hundreds marched through the streets, demanding police reform. Will wasn't there. He'd returned to his small apartment, but his image, bloodied face and defiant eyes, became a symbol for those crushed by the system. Meanwhile, Bobby faced total collapse. He was held in the county jail, awaiting trial on serious charges, assaulting a witness, abuse of power, and violating conduct codes. The Cleveland Police Department issued a statement, claiming an internal investigation, but no one bought it. Bobby's old colleagues, those who'd laughed with him, covered for him, turned away, distancing themselves like he was a stain. An anonymous officer told the press, "He went too far, no one can save him now." The system that once shielded Bobby had to cut ties, not for justice, but under pressure from public outrage. Will didn't seek fame, but fame found him. Activist groups reached out, asking him to speak, but he declined. "I just wanted the truth told," he said to the one reporter he agreed to meet, his voice low and weary. But his story outgrew his wishes. In Cleveland's poor neighborhoods, people began sharing their own tales of police harassment, inspired by Will to speak up. A middle-aged woman, standing amid a protest crowd, shouted, "If Will did it, we can too." The black community in Cleveland, and beyond, saw in him a glimmer of hope, not because he was a hero, but because he was one of them, an ordinary man who stood up. Inside the courthouse, Judge Clara Evans returned to her bench after the break, her face calm, but her eyes still sharp. She knew this case wasn't just a legal win, it was a warning to men like Bobby, and a validation for men like Will. The court record was updated, detailing every moment, and Clara ensured Bobby's prosecution would move swiftly. She looked out at the crowd through the window, hearing their chants, and understood that Will's strength had reached beyond these four walls. The impact didn't stop in Cleveland. Other cities took notice, small protests sparking in Detroit, Chicago, and beyond, with Will's image printed on t-shirts and banners. Bobby, from his cell, heard the news on the radio, his face darkening, as he realized his reputation wasn't just ruined, it was erased. He'd once believed himself untouchable, but now he was just a cursed name on everyone's lips. William Will Turner's small apartment in Cleveland was bathed in the dim light of late afternoon. He sat in an old armchair, calloused hands resting on his thighs, eyes gazing out the window, where distant city sounds echoed, sirens, chatter, and somewhere, chants from a small protest. All a background he didn't need to hear to understand. Will didn't turn on the TV, didn't read the papers, didn't care about headlines calling him a hero or symbol. To him that day in court wasn't about fame, it was about reclaiming justice, about voicing a truth he'd held too long. But he knew, whether he wanted it or not, he'd changed something, not just for himself, but for others. Meanwhile, Robert Bobby Malone sat in a cold corner of the county jail, light from a small window falling on his gaunt face. The police uniform once his pride was replaced by a dull orange jumpsuit, his cuffed hands now still on a metal table. He'd been sentenced, 8 years for assaulting a witness, and abuse of power, a swift, unyielding judgment from Judge Clara Evans. A radio in the corner blared news, the anchor's voice ringing. Former officer Malone loses everything after shocking courtroom attack. Bobby bowed his head, eyes empty, facing consequences he'd once thought could never touch him. Reputation, power, freedom, all gone, leaving him with solitude and shame he couldn't escape. Out there, Cleveland wasn't the same. Will's actions had ignited a movement that couldn't be stopped. Protests continued, not just downtown but in poor neighborhoods, where people once silent now stood to tell their stories. An older man, holding a Justice for Will sign, told a crowd, if he did it, we can too. It's time they listened. Activist groups held rallies, printing Will's face on t-shirts and posters, making him a symbol in the fight against injustice. But Will stayed home, quiet, leaving his mark through action, not words. Clara Evans, from her courthouse office, looked out at the crowd through the window. She knew this case wasn't just a legal victory, it was a wake-up call. She'd ensured Bobby faced punishment, but she also knew the system remained, its cracks exposed by Will. In the trial's final record, she wrote, Mr. Turner's actions prove justice comes not just from the law, but from the resilience of those who dare to stand. She looked at a photo of Will leaving the courthouse, head high, and wondered if he knew how many lives he'd changed with one shove. Will and Bobby's story wasn't just an incident, it was a message. Will had no power, no wealth, no status, but he had something Bobby never grasped, the courage to face injustice. Bobby, with his badge and the system's protection, once believed himself untouchable, but in the end, he lost to his own arrogance. Will's actions proved real strength lies not in outward power, but in inner will, the will to refuse submission, silence, or letting others define your worth. But the story doesn't end here. As Will gazed out his window, he thought of others out there, people still living in fear, still crushed by men like Bobby. He didn't know their names, but he knew they existed. And as Bobby sat in his cell, eyes fixed on the floor, he too knew that somewhere, other cops still believed they could do anything without consequence. A question hung in the air, unanswered. How many more Bobbys are out there, and who will be the next Will to challenge them? Cleveland kept moving, but the air had changed. The spark Will ignited had become a flame, spreading from this city to others, from one person to the next. Will rose from his chair, stepped onto his small balcony, and took a deep breath of cold air. He didn't need the news to know what he'd done, stretched far beyond that courtroom. Bobby, in his cell, heard the jailer's footsteps, feeling the weight of the walls confining him. 2 men, 2 fates. But their story left a big question for America. When those who uphold injustice realize they can't win forever, what happens next? And you, are you ready to face the answer? The story of Will Turner and Bobby Malone deeply reflects pressing issues in today's U.S. society: racial injustice, police abuse of power, and the strength of individual resistance. In Cleveland, Will, a 58-year-old black worker, faced Bobby, an arrogant cop who believed his badge made him untouchable. Bobby's punch in the courtroom wasn't just physical violence. It symbolized the oppression many black Americans still endure, from police brutality cases like George Floyd to daily inequities. But Will's defiance, standing up, shoving Bobby down, and declaring, "I've had enough," revealed a truth. Strength lies not in outward power, but in inner courage. Bobby's fall, from prison to ruined reputation, mirrored growing public pressure and movements like Black Lives Matter, forcing accountability on the system. Will's ripple effect, sparking protests and inspiring others, showed that one small act can shift a community. The lesson is this: in real-life America today, don't wait for someone grand to fix injustice. Anyone can be a Will. When facing insult or oppression, like Will staring down Bobby and refusing to stay silent, you too can speak up, whether by reporting wrongdoing, joining a protest, or simply supporting others. Your action, like Will's shove, could be the spark that breaks the silence, especially in a society still wrestling with fairness. Be resilient, but also wise, because as Clara showed, justice needs both courage and clarity to win. Don't forget to hit subscribe to follow stories of resilience like Will's with us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video to keep exploring the power of justice.